on this session. It would be a 45-minute fireside chat with Arvind, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. So please do drop in your questions in the Q&A box. Arvind would love to answer them. Professor Singh, I would now pass it on to you to kick off this most anticipated session of this conference.
Thank you, Shubham. It's my immense pleasure to welcome Dr. Arvind Krishna to Columbia Business School. He's a chairman and CEO of IBM, the venerable corporate IT firm. Arvind is both a business leader and a technologist at heart. He joined IBM in 1990, and over his 30 years career at IBM, he has led the building and expansion of new markets for IBM's AI, cloud, quantum computing, and blockchain. He most recently built on his vision of hybrid cloud market, where he drove the successful acquisition of 34 billion Red Hat, the biggest vendor of open source software and the largest software acquisition in IBM's history. Many said it was a very, very unlikely acquisition, and that acquisition Arvind has added to the success of IBM. Arvind has an undergraduate degree from Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, and a PhD from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Actually, we are contemporaries, almost starting the career roughly at the same time. I should point out that my association with IBM dates back. All my research was supported by IBM under a fellowship. I spent time at Yorktown Heights that Arvind joined and rose to the director of it. So welcome, Mr. Krishna. It is an immense pleasure to meet you and to welcome you at Columbia.
Professor Singh, thank you so much for that very kind introduction and overly generous words.
Let's begin with going back to India. Your childhood, you're growing up there, you as a student, and how the education, the upbringing prepared you for this role, and how that transition, how that journey panned out. Because this is the part of you that we as an Indian are most curious about, because we can draw lessons from it in terms of what leads to success, what mindset, what cultural background, what upbringing, what values facilitated this.
Yeah. So, Professor Singh, I'm not sure that there is any magic answer in here. So, one, India is a bit of a melting pot of cultures. And I was probably an extreme example of that. I grew up all over India. I spent years in the north, probably more years in the north than any other, but I also spent years in the south, in Tamil Nadu. I spent years in the east, in the very top of the border of West Bengal and Assam. I spent years in the west, in Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh. And so in some sense, you get exposed to all the different cultures. So differences are not to be exploited. Differences are more to be enjoyed, because you get different people, they have different values, not massively, but somewhat. At least when I was growing up in India, I mean, I was born in '62. So you get the aspects when India was really a much poorer country than it is today. And my parents were not wealthy. We lived a good life, but my father worked for the government, for the Indian Army. And so consequently, you knew that your only way to success in life, if you wanted it, was through education and advancing yourself. It was not going to be based on standing on somebody else's shoulders, except maybe the shoulders of all the teachers and people you learn from. So that was evident. And maybe because of the way you grew up all over India, I was always very focused on outcome, meaning, work that is unnecessary, work that doesn't seem to have any permanence, a work that doesn't seem to impact the longer term outcome. I was pretty quick to say that you can do with a call it a passing grade. Work which is really important to a longer term outcome, you got to put into a much deeper base of knowledge. And so that was one thing you learned, because I probably went through, I forget how many, 7 or 8 different schools before I finished high school. Now, it helped me, but that's a very personal, that in India, at least, where you went to college, 50% of the time was not based on your entire 12-year academic history, but was based on one entrance exam. So back to my outcome point, that means I could focus on that one thing as opposed to everything else. And it works for some people. I'm not going to say it works for everyone, but it certainly worked for me. For me, the difference was getting into IIT Kanpur. I'd say that I was a good student, but not an exceptional one, in the sense that I could certainly learn the material, but I didn't focus so much on why I was learning it. That changed instantly at IIT. Maybe it was the quality of the instructors, maybe it was the colleagues around you, maybe it was the intense competition both to get in and survive there. But I suddenly became really focused on learning why I'm doing something and how it can have a much longer term impact. And that lesson probably is the most systemic and endemic one. So when you learn something, then you're going to apply it for everything else you do. And then you learn there isn't one way to do things, there are multiple. And so coming to the grips with that and having instructors and faculty who embrace that, who didn't fight that, who didn't say that's the only way you can do something. If you have an alternate way, they would certainly welcome it than the one that was either in the book or the one that taught or the one that your colleagues were doing. And so that really let you do it with different ways. And that really is the core of engineering and a way of thinking about things. And that love of learning so that you can apply the learning in everything is something that I think has stuck with me. And the other part is you also got exposed, back to my cultural melting point, to people from all different parts of India, different provinces, different languages, different socioeconomic backgrounds. And it's fundamental in my personality. That means that you should never take things at face value. The person may or may not speak well, but may be completely brilliant. The person may speak well and really not be very dedicated. And so you kind of learned that you can now, so I always believe that you should take to people and see what is the best they can do, not worry about all their weaknesses, but what is it that they can do really, really well? Because it was obvious to me in college that everybody in there had some unique skill. Sorry, really long answer to your simple question.
No. It is very revealing. And what I get from you is several factors. If I may summarize it for my students, that to separate long-term goals from the short-term. And many times we get consumed in the short-term and forget the bigger picture. The second part you pointed out beautifully is the transience of life, transience of the position. The fact that you kept moving because of your family, because of your dad, made you realize how to adapt, how to be ready for the next move, which is a really extremely valuable lesson. Many of us who grow up in one part of India, we don't get that. We become resigned to it, or we become entrenched in this. The third thing you pointed out was the fairness of the Indian education system, where somebody from a poor background like me and you can give an entrance test and fairly end up in one of the best institutions in the world, like IIT. The fourth you pointed was the pressure cooker that IIT was in terms of its intense competition, that we find out that it is not just you, but there are amazing group of people with intellect, with intelligence, and complementing that, the quality of teaching that was at IIT was completely at a different level than what we had in high school. And that created a growth, an opportunity to think, encouraging the question. And finally, the most important thing you have pointed out is India is a multicultural society. Sunil Mittal once, the Bharti Airtel's head, said that if you can succeed in India, you can succeed anywhere, because it is not one country. It is mixture of languages and culture, and you experienced all of this. So extremely interesting. I will take you a little bit more deeper into India as I see the success of Indian community here. And it is not just you. If I can name some name, whether it is Satya Nadella, Sundar Pichai, Santanu Narayan, Parag Agarwal, Sarmista Dubey, the list is long, and these are just the top tier. There is a whole bench at the next level and the next level. Compare these names to another set of name I'm going to name from China: Pony Ma, Jack Ma, Zhang Yiming, Wang Xing, Colin Huang, Ren Jingfei, Richard Liu, Li Jun. What is different about these names?
Look,
Instead of, let me,
yeah.
Mr. Krishna, I would like to make the question explicit for the benefit of my audience. We are proud that IBM and Microsoft and Alphabet and Adobe and Twitter is being headed by amazing set of Indians. At the same time, when I compare with China and see the rise of tech firms like Tencent and Alibaba and ByteDance and Meituan and Pinduoduo and Huawei, and the list is really long, I cannot help but wonder these two different models of success, where Indians are immensely successful as head of Western firms. And the same did not happen with the set of Indians in starting up an entrepreneurial development of India. And this is a structural problem for us. What explains this at a personal level, at a structural level?
Look, first of all, I don't think it's as black and white. As a really good academic and professor, you painted it a bit more black and white, because I will point out, even in India, there are some, but I'll acknowledge not as many as in China. You have the Sunil Mittal, you already mentioned him. There's Mukesh Ambani, there's Ratan Tata, there's Nataraj Chandrasekhar, there is Azim Premji, there is Narayan Murthy. We can go on and on. These are all people who have put firms on the global stage, but they are less about egotistical, they are less about putting either their company or their own brand name out there, unlike in China. So let's come back to your fundamental question. A lot of Indians have succeeded in the West, because also in Europe, in the UK and in Western Europe, there are some. However, the Chinese success seems to be much more grounded in China, where they have created these firms. So what distinguishes an entrepreneur from anything else? It's the risk appetite. So the risk appetite was not there in India till very recently. And by risk appetite, I mean, when you start off saying, I have this idea, not just me, but the conditions, the economic conditions do say there is some merit in it. Now, to get a firm going, there are so many variables that are outside your control. Can you get your capital raised? Can you be in a place where you can get the right skills and employees? Can you get your marketing in order to be able to make people aware? Can you get distribution in order if it's a physical good? Because the companies you mentioned, Huawei needs distribution, whereas Tencent and Baidu and Alibaba are much more about marketing and making people aware of the service. So are the economic conditions in the environment appropriate to make all those work? Is regulation going to be your friend or your enemy? And so as you look upon all that, until very recently, there wasn't a capital structure in India which let people take a risk of, let's say, even $100 million. I think that has changed a little bit recently, but it is far behind both the US and China. And so there are, I think, 25 odd unicorns. Maybe I could be wrong. Maybe it's now 30 or 40. There are firms that have bootstrapped. I mean, certainly, again, to go back to my friend Sunil Mittal, Bharti Airtel was bootstrapped. It wasn't created by something else. But those examples are few and far between, and they're a lot smaller than some of the Chinese examples you mentioned. Now, India drove a language that once you got to most of the institutions was also in English. That implied that the people could be much more comfortable inside the US and be able to communicate their ideas. India as a culture, I think, is right balance between East and West. And that, I think, lets Indians thrive in the West a lot easier. And now I'm going to get into some areas which I think are speculative, but are probably appropriate. If you go to the extreme East, the culture is very much about a common society. You do something for the benefit of society, even if it harms the individual. If you come to the West, it's very much about the individual must thrive. Of course, you have to provide a benefit to society. Otherwise, why would anybody be giving you money, at least for a commercial or capitalist enterprise? I think India was balanced right in the middle. And so it let people thrive in Western society and a capitalist society easier than maybe some others. And so I think that that let Indians thrive and become leaders in the West. I think there is going to be more success in India also, but maybe because it's not a top-down economy, it is a democracy, maybe the firms will not become as large as the winner-take-alls that are present in China. But maybe that's better. Maybe we want not one Alibaba, but 100 Airtels or Reliance or Geos, or we can go on the examples. Maybe it's more like Germany, where there's 1,000 middle manufacturers and automobile and industrials, as opposed to 4 megas. And I think that that is the question. That is the inflection point that India is at with the current GDP and the growth. And I think the current opportunities that are there in front of us, whether we think about the Indo-Pacific economic framework, yes, it's not done, but I have optimism that maybe if both sides strive between the US and India, we can get there. Maybe what's talked about in the Quad. I think new trading blocks are emerging. It's an opportunity India has that I think has not been seen in 7 decades since independence. The question is, will both sides, both the West and India, want to take advantage of the current environment to say India can become a really good partner to the West? And I will always say equal partner. You cannot have a superior and inferior in the relationship. But that is the opportunity that is there now. And we talked about the lack of risk capital, but maybe that's changing a little bit. Maybe it's not as extreme as it was in China, but there is more today than there was 30 years ago, for sure.
As you explain these differences, 2 questions that arises in my mind, and you were right to point out Mr. Murthy and Premji and Mittal. A large number of Chinese entrepreneurs, at least in technology firms, were Western educated, who took the idea, went back, pursued, at least initially, almost like a copycat ideas, and then they further innovated and made it better. What role the protected market that China had played in the rise of these firms? You know, India was for long period, we were protectionist, not welcoming Western firm. And I almost feel as if we liberalized at the wrong time where the protection was needed for the rise of technology firm. Is my interpretation right? In other words, was the rise of many of these firms mostly because we kept the Google and Amazon and other Western firms at bay, almost making sure that internal firm succeed?
I agree with half your thesis, but not the second half.
Yeah.
I agree with your thesis that the success of some of these firms in China was indeed because it was much harder for Western firms to compete effectively for the same markets in China. Absolutely. We can go into banking, financial services, not just technology, and it was not that it was impossible. It was just that the conditions that were demanded for them to enter those markets were just hard for many of us to meet in completion. So the markets were much smaller for Western firms, so it let locals rise and live. You use the word protected. I use the word regulation helped the rise and success of those firms. Maybe a more polite word to use. The part I disagree with is I don't think the lack of protectionism in India or regulation was the reason for the lack of these firms there. I go much more to India is a democracy. India is not authoritarian. It's not a single party, it's a multi-party. Not only is it multi-party, each state is multi-party, and so you have all of those conditions. So when you're in that mode, but India also has a significant 600-700 million people still are very rural and still live in a lot of poverty. So where does the capital of the country go to? Does it go to the infrastructure and helping out all those people, or does it go to helping entrepreneurs succeed, who typically tend to be, I'll call it, in tier 1 and tier 2 cities? So that difference then means that you have firms that succeed, but there isn't, I go back to the winner take all. I mean, there are local phone makers now in India. There are local auto manufacturers in India. Now, will either of them be able to export globally? That's yet to be proven. So the companies that are succeeding in China certainly succeed really well inside. Outside of Huawei, I'm not sure that the rest have succeeded yet on being on a global stage. Whereas India has far more success, certainly in technology and textiles, in having their brand names on a global stage. China, on the other hand, has succeeded in doing a lot of low-cost manufacturing that is sitting inside other brand names, but it's not their brand name. So which model is better for the long term? I don't know. I mean, if I was to put a crystal ball out there, in 20 years, I think the ability to put your own brand name out there allows you to capture more value in the long term. It may have been the wrong answer for the short term. So I don't think that this is yet played out, or that it is yet a conclusion that cannot get changed by actions of regulators and entrepreneurs, and where there is reward in society for the people who do these things.
I will go back to Indian tech firm a little bit more. If I look at Infosys, Wipro, and TCS, others, we developed a model where we became the third party IT solution, customer service solution for Western firms. As the role of AI is becoming prominent, as more countries are competing in voice and programming and other things, suddenly it looks like the Indian firms' dominance in that area is on shaky ground. Where do you see that future evolving? What threat the Indian firms face given these new realities of technological evolution?
I think that's a really important question, and one that is on the mind of many, many leaders, as well as people entering the workforce like all your students today. So I'm going to begin with a slightly different example and then answer your question quite directly. I think around 1900, 50% of the workers in the United States, I think it was 47 maybe, but I'll call it 50, worked in growing food, agriculture. And I'm including animal husbandry in there. Today, maybe 1% of the population works directly in there. That 49% of the jobs didn't go like evaporate, and 49% are just sitting there twiddling their thumbs. As a consequence, you got fast food restaurants, you got food service, you got packaged foods, you got retail, you got all these other opportunities that opened up, and actually communication services, we can go on and on, as you took people out of what was mundane labor and moved into other things. The reason I went back a century, because now we can study that well, as opposed to it's just a speculation. So it didn't create a lack of jobs, it actually created more jobs in total in society. Okay, now when we fast forward into AI, yes, you're right. I fundamentally believe that a lot of basic call center operations, basic clerical tech jobs will absolutely get replaced by AI. But what is the issue? I look at myself both as an employer, and we also provide some of these services. It lets people move to the next higher level service. There is a complete lack of labor mobility. Demographics imply there are more people aging and there are fewer children born. So there isn't enough skilled labor in the world. So when you're in that position, as AI replaces those, you can now apply people to the jobs which provide a lot more value to the enterprise and the nation. And consequently, I actually think that for every job lost to AI, maybe 2 jobs get created, because the enterprise, when it has more cash flow, hopefully your students are a little business oriented. If the enterprise has more cash flow, they can invest in things that may take a little bit longer to come all the way to profit and market, but then those create even more long-term value, which means you get more jobs. And so that is the virtuous cycle I believe that technology and automation have always created. Imagine, without computers, could you have a global bank? It'll be impossible, because you'd have to have 1 million people sitting behind doing computations on what's your interest, what have you learned, what is your record. There'll be errors. If there's a fire somewhere, oh my God, my complete record is destroyed. So without automation and technology, you cannot have scalable businesses. And I believe fundamentally that all work that is routine in nature is going to then get replaced. If it's routine and vaguely digital, by AI, there are so many jobs in the physical, I'll call it, or analog economy that are much tougher. We don't yet know how to do all those, but those will. But it'll allow people then to do other tasks and be able to do human interaction, which allows for a lot more overall value. So I think that as I look at all of these companies, they're going to find that they have actually used automation. Like if you go read TCS's reports, they talk quite a bit about how they've taken their people, they've deployed a lot of technology inside. And I think they talk about 20, 30, 40% of what used to be done by people is now done by technology, but that lets them then address a wider market. And that has contributed to their growth and their market cap. We talk about the same on how so many things we used to do internally are now done by technology, like so many of our functions where, like, for example, in our HR practices are now done by technology. And consequently, what is the value in me calling up some help desk and asking them, please move an employee from A to B, or please promote somebody, or please raise somebody? That should be done by technology. And people should worry much more about mentoring others and working with clients and all those other tasks. Now, if we had way too much labor and way too many workers, that's a different issue. I mean, take IT. I think IT has 10 to 30 million workers less than what we would like. Cybersecurity has 3 million less than what we would like. So we can go on and on. Healthcare, how many fewer are there? As we get older populations, you're going to need tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people deployed into geriatric healthcare and looking after people living in their homes. These are jobs that didn't even exist 20 years ago. So sorry, really long answer, but I believe that routine tasks will indeed be automated, leveraging both AI, but also automation techniques.
First of all, I find your answers fascinating. So I don't mind longer answers because it makes me understand. As you were explaining the role of AI and where the world is headed, one of the thoughts that came to my mind, education in India by and large, and we are not talking about IIT, but the general education, is even today literacy and information oriented, rather than innovation and creating thoughtfulness, critical thinking oriented. And that raises a question in the new world. Does India has preparation with the right institution, with right kind of education for us to succeed? I see it in other aspects also. And again, you know, I'm not suffering from China envy, but it is a good example of our neighbor, also a developing country with similar problems, who have tackled this at a much broader scale. If I compare the number of good educational institutions, investment in education in China, it is at a very, very rapid pace compared to where we used to be. There was a time where I felt that IITs had a lead, Indian universities had a lead. Now in that global ranking, we are falling behind. Institutions of excellence that can put us on world map are fewer and fewer. Where do you see that going, and what India can do to change it? What are some of the missed opportunity that we are not working on to assure the future rise?
Well, one is pretty straightforward. When you have an economy that is 4 times larger, I mean, unless there's complete irrationality, everything will be 4 times more. That's just a simple fact. You have more money for doing things. 2, I am not as much of a believer in all the rankings. Yes, I understand you're referring to the QS rankings and the Shanghai ranking and the Times rankings of the universities of how many appear on the global top 200 or 300 or 500. I think all that has some meaning, but all those are very heavily oriented towards just prestige in graduate school, much more than undergraduate. If I look at undergraduate, I do agree with your point. I think that critical thinking, so the way India evolved, it was very important to teach, actually not just literacy, I think also numerical literacy.
Yeah.
So you're facile in being able to solve rote problems. And so there is a bit of numerical literacy, a little bit of literacy in reading, and a lot of, I'll call it, being able to regurgitate knowledge, right? Which is what I think you're reflecting on. I think that is largely true for China also. I don't think that is that different. Now, as we go forward, if you are going to be able to get into what you call critical thinking, I think it's a small change. I don't think it's a huge change, but it does mean that you have to be able to read books. I do think you have to be able to have a critical discussion of what you agree with and don't agree with. And like I reflected on my own undergraduate education, the faculty has to be very secure that the student can disagree with them completely and actually still get a very high grade. Those are changes that are more cultural in nature than necessarily a spending of capital and money. I think that is the change that is needed. And that goes back to the risk. Hey, we encourage you to be different. You don't have to all be conformist. And I think that is the piece that has to change in the education. By the way, you see it a little bit when you talk about the startup culture, at least in Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, Hyderabad. There is a bit of it that is coming there, but not enough. I do agree with your point that outside of few elite institutions, that aspect of critical thinking, discussion, disagreement, debate is not fostered. And so how do you foster it in a society which very much goes towards well, did you get a 98 on that final exam or not? And I think that is what is going to go happen. But I think that as the opportunities open up to do many more things, some of that I think is going to happen. I think, look, in the end, it's a democracy and it's a semi-capitalist society. So if there is a market for those skills, I do believe that over a decade, not over a century, that there will be those who will spring up. I mean, if I think about all the private colleges today, they didn't exist 30 or 40 years ago. 30, 40 years ago, they were all state. Now there are more private ones that are opening up for certain areas. Ditto, if there is value in society to having dissension and debate, there will be colleges, maybe not high schools, that'll open up to do that. And I do suspect that'll happen more and more because it is a global economy to some extent. It is not confined to a single country.
Thank you. I will turn a little bit towards IBM now from India. I have to tell you an episode. Sam Palmisano was the first recipient of Deming Cup that Columbia University gives. And in that reception, Ginny Rometty was also present. And at that time, if I remember right, she has been already nominated to be the CEO, selected to be CEO. So during the get-together, I asked her that it took IBM 100 years to have a woman CEO. How long it will take before a foreigner an immigrant who grew up somewhere else will become CEO. Ginny laughed at that question. She said, we don't look at IBM internally based upon the national origin and all that. But I did not know at that time that the next CEO will actually be a foreigner, so to speak, somebody like you who has been educated outside. My question to you is, historically, IBM has chosen a candidate internally, except in recent years, Lou Gerstner was the only one who came from outside. Why that process? What is the benefit of that process? And how do you view the leadership culture, the growth culture within IBM, how it had changed in last few decades that you have been there? And an added question to that, you are a researcher. You basically were a nerd who joined Yorktown Heights. I worked there one summer. I had high regards. It is better research institution than many universities. If I had not come and joined university, I would have been at research center like Yorktown Heights. How your transition played from a researcher to a corporate leader, and what it tells us about IBM. So it is a set of questions, but I will let you interpret and answer it.
Look, first, I take a lot of pride in the number of leaders on the national stage that have had experience with IBM. Like if I look at the Michael Armstrong, who led AT&T for a while. Before that, he led Hughes Network Systems. Then there was George Conrades, who was Akamai before Tom Layton took it back in some sense. We can go to so many companies across the nation and so many entrepreneurs who have had experience at IBM. I think that speaks to the leadership development culture. Now, the models change over time, and this allows me to reflect a little bit. It is on both IBM, the corporation, and then the leadership that evolves. IBM began as international business machines. Your audience probably doesn't even know. The first products were weighing scales, time recording clocks. That's why CTR, for computing, tabulating, and recording. Recording as in recording time cards.
Yeah.
Okay. Then Watson Sr., the original person who put CTR together and renamed it IBM in 1911 through 14, had the brilliant idea of acquiring an entrepreneur called Herman Hollerith and what became the punch card reader. That had massive success when the New Deal got signed in 1932, because it became the backbone on how Social Security and the IRS recorded and kept records of all of the income of every citizen in the United States. So you go from business machines to the next era being punch cards. Punch cards, by the way, were electromechanical devices based on electric motors, and mechanical as in literally punches driving through wood and steel. You then fast forward into 1945 through 47, and you began to have what were called electronic calculators. And I'm putting electronics in quotes. And why is an electronic calculator so interesting? It allowed a bank to calculate interest every day, aka compound interest, as opposed to simple interest once every 6 months. That was a business advantage that let some go ahead of others because they could do that for all their clients. So the mixture of punch cards and electronic calculators. The late 1950s, so semiconductors. IBM didn't invent semiconductors, Bell Labs did. But when IBM saw the technology, it was obvious to Watson Jr., you could use these to make computers that were far more scalable, manufacturable, low cost, and that gave rise to the mainframe. So where I'm going with that is, and you began by talking about AI and cloud and quantum, the technology changes. You have to learn how to apply the technology to improve a business dramatically. That has been IBM's credo and heart. When a technology lasts for 10 to 15 years, somebody coming from a market, sales, client background is going to succeed dramatically because you have a point of invention and then you have 10 to 20 years of deployment. And by the way, when I say that, I'm very much channeling one of your colleagues, Carlota Perez, who is an economic historian who talks about technological revolutions and how they happen. But I'm putting it into 10 to 20 year period. She talks about 50 and 60 year periods. Now we're at a time when technology is changing much more rapidly. And so to give credit to IBM and its board, they look at leaders who can help guide IBM through the current period of inflection. And so when you're at a period of inflection, much like Watson Sr., when companies were coming together for scaling, Watson Jr., who saw what semiconductors could do, maybe my selection is because I have a vision for what we should do, leveraging these technologies you talked about, right? Then that said, it's always a team effort. Now you got to construct a team around you who can get all of these things done. How do you get everybody aligned to move forward on these things? And it's as important to select what you don't do as what you do. Because I think what has also changed in the world, and when I went back to the difference between US, India, China in terms of risk appetite and capital, it's becoming very much a time when you have to put all of your capital and investment behind a couple of things as opposed to widely disseminated across 10 or 20 things. When it's that, then you have to be very, very focused on what not to do as much as what to do. And that means you also have to learn how to partner. So as you take all those things into account, I think that made the board select somebody like me. Okay, you can understand the technology, but you've had enough business success that you know what to do there. You have a risk appetite of what to do around capital. You have a way to motivate your employees. But in the end, you have to be able to understand deeply what do clients want to have done, and can you succeed with them? At the end, they write the checks. Nothing else writes the checks, right? Mm-hmm. And we are a reasonably large company. I take pride in that we are one of the iconic companies in the country. That shows in the attention that gets paid to what we do, and that's a virtue, and it always puts us under the spotlight also. So I think I answered your question on what lets IBM have leaders develop. Why was I selected? I don't think people looked at the ethnicity and the international background. But going back to your very first question, the fact that I am willing to adapt, I'm not stuck in the past, and I am not overly stuck in being aspirational as in 10 years out. Maybe that comes from the way I was raised. Maybe it comes from the fact that I came here as an immigrant. I don't know whether all those things play into it. And I've always bounced between technology and business for my 30 years at IBM. So maybe all those played into the selection that was mine.
A related question on this, which is the rate of development and the nature of competition. Microsoft was a non-entity until IBM developed the personal computer and got them to develop the operating system. I joke with my class that IBM had the kind of programmers. This is the company that invented programming language that could have written the operating system for Microsoft sitting on toilet. That company today is $2.5 trillion company. Alphabet came from nowhere and it is $2 trillion company. What it tells you about the nature of competition in this business, the rapid rise and fall of organization, and what we can learn about the tenuous nature of dominance and what it takes to succeed, to even be alive. IBM has been much, much longer for a technology firm. The average life of a US corporation is 50 years. This has outlived its useful life more than 100 years. So in terms of adaptation, it is an amazing firm. But is it adapting fast enough? Is this acceleration poses a different framework for the competition and how you are adapting for this?
I think that will be determined 10 years from now or 20 years from now as opposed to now. So I'd say that. Now, back to your story on the operating system. The reason IBM picked Microsoft for the operating system is Yeah, sure. There are plenty of operating systems inside IBM. One could go write one's own. Would it be as small, as lightweight, as simple as the one Microsoft provided is a big question. Ditto. Intel was picked for the microprocessor. We had plenty of microprocessors inside, but maybe they were not as low power and as cost effective as the Intel one. So the goodness is that you understand where your weaknesses lie and you go work with partners and ecosystems. To your question about surviving and thriving going forward, it's all about which opportunities do you grab onto and which ones do you not. So in your story there, that was the IBM PC story, right? Circa 1980 through 1984. And that gave rise to two firms that are massive, Microsoft and Intel. But to give credit to Microsoft, it was really in the last 10 years that they have gone to these ultra large market caps and success. They had plenty of years in the middle where they were not thriving as much as any of that. So they went from a 15-year, I'll call it doldrums, maybe is the right word, and they kind of went sideways to a success because they seized an opportunity. Back to my point I was making in response to your last question about you've got to seize an opportunity and you've got to put all your effort behind it. If you're a custodian of a company, that's very hard to do because then you're taking risk by putting all your eggs in one or two baskets. Then as you get bigger, you can actually go into 3 or 4. But the days when you had a conglomerate and you really were taking no risk, you were just allocating capital in 10 buckets. I think those days are over, actually. Maybe they'll come back in 30 years, but they're over for my working lifetime for 100%. So given the areas we are taking, we have gone from -2% revenue growth to now +5. We actually generated a bit more than that in the last quarter. We have committed to +5 for this year already. That's in step towards going towards higher numbers down the road. But let's first deliver 5 so that we can feel good about that we have an organization, we have capacity, we have the right products, we have the right mentality to do that. That opens up how much? That opens up billions more of cash flow and capital each year. So that means our investment capacity increases each year. So if we play out just the 5% thesis, that means our growth will accelerate down the road, not deaccelerate, right? Assuming you're making reasonably good allocation decisions. So that is where a lot of what is taught in the kind of courses you all teach become relevant. What are you investing in? But I keep pointing to, you cannot do it in a risk-free way. I don't know any industry today where it is risk-free, because if it is risk-free, that means it is really easy for some entrepreneur to come in to say, you know something, that's a profit pool. I can come in with a cheaper idea. I can live with less margin than them. I can be a bit more digital, and I can take this away over 10 years. And we can see that again and again in different industries that is happening. I think that that is the nature of destruction in capitalism, and it's a good thing because it gives rise to more competition, it gives rise to better prices, it gives rise to better outcome and quality for the eventual, I'll call it customer, because it may be an individual or it may be an enterprise. But it leads to a much better allocation of capital in the end. I think we are now on the virtuous side of that. The same as the example that you took. I'm not going to take the name. They went through many years of going sideways, but the last 8 years has been incredible for them. I'll predict that we will have an incredible decade to come. And that is then the proof of, are we going to thrive or are we not? But I believe from the reaction I get from all our clients, many of the fundamental themes. So we believe in sovereignty of data. I think the current geopolitics say that that's the correct bet to take. We believe that automation is going to be really important. We believe that most enterprises and governments view technology as a competitive advantage for themselves. It's not a cost of doing business anymore. Completely contrary to what Nicholas Carr, another of your fellow academics, tried to write 20 years ago, where he basically labeled IT as a commodity like concrete and steel. I think we can all agree it's the exact opposite. So if you have all those conditions, now it's up to us to seize some of them and make our clients succeed, which is how we'll succeed. We don't sell products to individuals. That's not where we are good.
IBM has, and this probably will be my last question before we go to a student's questions, other participants' question. IBM has a formidable presence in India. I often joke with my students that IBM really stands for Indian business machine, no longer international business machine. In terms of type of work that gets done in India now, in terms of IBM's growth in India, what is changing? What is on the horizon, since you represent both IBM and an Indian? You are in a unique position to explain that.
Look, if I go back to IBM's presence in India, there are two phases to that presence. One is that we are a big presence in the local market. Like, we are so proud of the work we do with the State Bank of India, with Bharti Airtel, with Reliance, with the Bank of India, with the Bank of Baroda, with Asian Paints. I can go on and on. That is a really important presence for us to be able to take. Now, the second part, what are the disciplines that we have there? So many years ago, the massive expansion of IBM in India was around managed services. Note, managed services is no longer part of IBM. That is what we spun out as Kyndryl last year, announced it in 2020, got it completed last year. So that part of our Indian population is part of Kyndryl, it's not part of IBM. But we're even bigger than we were 10 years ago, because since then, we've decided to expand massively in consulting and in R&D. So those are called our global functions based in India because of the skill pool, because of the talent, because of, I'll call it the relative stability of the politics and the regulatory environment, and India's ability to create the economic zones that make it advantageous to place some of those disciplines there. But the biggest reason is skills. So if you want people who can be trained engineers and learn how to implement SAP so that a client in packaged goods knows to get the benefit and how do we partner with SAP to do that, what better place to put that team than in India? If I look at our R&D functions, some of our chip design, some of our operating system work is done in India. If I look at how we work around integration and cybersecurity, some of that work is done in India. So recently, we also realized we were mostly in tier 1 cities, Calcutta, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Noida, Pune, Mumbai. But we realized that we are now in India. Wait, Coimbatore, Kochi, Ahmedabad, Lucknow, these are all places where we should expand. So we are doing that expansion. And everywhere we go, it's two things. There is one face to the local market, because we absolutely would like to be good players there. When I talk to the Indian government, they absolutely embrace us because we have a big local presence. So I don't see inhibitors. Of course, it's a very competitive market, so you got to go compete. And the second is we put global talent in India so that they can service the globe from India. COVID may have been the biggest beneficiary for India, not just for IBM, because now everybody accepts remote work. It's no longer an aberration. It's no longer, why is your team somewhere there? Okay, as long as you can be good about the cybersecurity, you have the correct business employment conditions with your employees, you can go expand. So maybe again, a long answer on India, but I'm really optimistic about India on both those fronts.
Thank you. I have so many questions. We can continue this chat for a long time, but I want to be democratic and bring participants' question. So I will transition to that. A question is, what advice would you give to MBA students who plan to join a major technology firms today and aspire to rise to become CEO or at higher rank?
Look, you have to be in, I don't think there is a particular path. This is not like consulting or investment banking, where in consulting you go in, you're an analyst, you become a practitioner, you become a junior partner and a partner. I think there's very many paths. I think for an MBA, probably coming into product management, but keep a very close eye and keep an understanding. You don't need to be a programmer or an engineer, but you need to understand what their constraints are. Because for a technology firm, at the end of the day, there is the product you build, and that has two sides to it. So by product management, what I mean is an understanding of what does the client want, how do you express its value, where is the engineering team spending its energy and its time, how do you make things friction-free? If you develop some of those skills, and there is no superhuman who has all of those skills, then you'll be able to advance your career dramatically because there's an outcome that the company gets and recognizes and feeds on. Note, what are some of the things I didn't mention? I didn't mention be deep in accounting. I didn't mention be deep in finance. While those are really important skills, I think those you should understand them, but you don't need to be the personal expert on those. You can rely upon others because in the end, the quality of your product probably determines for a tech firm success much more than some of the other areas.
The second question from audience is, what was the number one priority when you became IBM CEO? And what is your number one priority now, how it has changed?
So I'll answer a bit more than the way the question got asked, because I became IBM CEO on April 6th, 2020. And since some of your students are in New York City, you remember what New York City looked like in April of 2020? It looked like a war zone with overflowing hospitals and nurses and doctors overworked. So my priority on the day I became CEO was, I couldn't predict, is the market's going to go down 15% or 20% or 30%? And since we are a large bellwether, will our revenue go down that much? So priority number one on day one was liquidity. How do we make sure that we can remain solvent through how long this takes? A really straightforward answer to give. So that really occupied a month. I wouldn't say it occupied more than that. Once I became comfortable that we have enough solvency and we have enough actions that we could survive a 2 to 3 year downturn that was significant, okay. Then you have to turn to how do you come out stronger? And so that went back to my original thesis. What areas are we going to pick? What areas are we going to not pick? And that became, let's spin out Kyndryl. Let's double down on Red Hat. Let's focus on giving a lot more value to our clients. Let's stop with only heavy marketing, but become much more technologically oriented and bringing value to our clients and investing very heavily in what we call garages and client engineering. So those all became actions that took 1.5 years to play out. And then we saw that outcome last year at the end for the first time when we returned to growth. And hopefully we'll keep seeing that play out this year. And then it'll be time to double down on some of those in terms of more areas. So hopefully I gave you a straightforward answer on what was then. To me, growth above GDP is the critical measure of success. That lets a company thrive really well. So, and then I'll say subtext, not just growth above GDP, but you got to look at growth in your market sector. And so growth at or above the market growth in your industry is what becomes critical.
Dr. Krishna, we wish you luck. And basically what you are saying is that best is yet to come. You have just started and you started at a very, very difficult period. A student asks that you are an inspiration to many, and I can see this in my student population. Curious to hear who has been your inspiration along the journey, who or what has had the largest influence on your leadership style?
Look, there's lots of people. I'll begin with one of my grandmothers who grew up relatively, I'll call it, poor in India. Her father was a train conductor, my great-grandfather. She became one of the first female physicians in India, and her motto through her life, when she was 70, she would get on a ladder and climb on the roof to fix it because she didn't have the patience to wait for somebody to come a week later. It's self-sufficiency. My father, who was very much focused always on outcome. What are you doing that has a critical part of the outcome? My mother, who believed in that you should always be very self-sufficient and independent and trust yourself, have confidence in what you can get accomplished. Some of my professors and teachers, whether at IIT Kanpur, and I talked about some of that earlier on how they taught you to really think for yourself, to my graduate school advisor, Bruce Hayek, who really taught you to think for yourself and to have confidence in what you can get done. All of these people have an influence in you. Some of the books you read have an influence on you. I really actually fundamentally believe when you're interacting with somebody, try to take something from that 30 minutes, because invariably everybody you talk to has something that is of unique value. And you try to take that. I mean, I do that always, whether you talk to people within the enterprise, you talk to your clients, you talk to fellow CEOs, you talk to government. There's always something you can take away because they're coming at it from their own perspective. But I mentioned the 5 or 6 who are probably the most influential. Oh, but they had years of influence on me, not just a moment of 30 minutes.
Thank you. One of the questions deals with the AI and the biases that it carries from people to the algorithm. Could you share how IBM is addressing some of these ethical concern in AI or data privacy and other related things? Any thought on how these biases affects and going to affect our life more and more, and what we can do about it?
Yeah, really good question. So AI is wonderful. AI is wonderful as in if you feed it a lot of data, it will learn from the data and then be able to reproduce outcomes that are similar to the data it has learned from. Given that data has been in the past created by humans, AI is going to be wonderful at perfectly reproducing every bias of human history. I'm being a little extreme in my statement, but not that far from the truth. Okay, so given that that is the case, how do we get around it? Luckily, because it's now digital and not just human decision-making, you can check for biases. Now, we should also be careful. We should not play God. We should only check for biases of those that are authorized and legal to check for. Is it gender? Is it age? Is it ethnicity? Is it zip code? There are things you can check for. So you can actually check the data. Simple example, in a mortgage application, suppose you create an AI-based application, and you can say, look, we shouldn't have a gender bias. Men and women should get the same approval rates, given everything else is equal. Of course, from your background, you know, how do you control everything else is equal? That's almost impossible to check. But the advantage of digital technologies is you can have synthetic test data. So you can put through a set of cases that are male-based, and then all you can do is change the name to be female and check whether you get the same answer or not. And if you don't, and it'll be shocking how when you learn from just data, it picks up from just names what the gender can be. It picks up from names what the ethnicity can be, because the black box nature of AI is such that it does pick those things up. But you can then check against those and correct it. By the way, this is a very deep area. We put out a lot of technologies in open source. We put out an AI fairness toolkit that lets you check your AI models for that. And then you got to make sure they're not drifting, because since AI is learning, they can drift back to where they want. I'm not going to mention the examples. People have seen how AI can be trained to be quite abusive as maybe toy examples, but those can exist in reality too. So I think AI fairness is a really important topic. And before you put it into practice, you should make sure of that. By the way, the EU put out a pretty good framework where they talked about levels of impact, level 1 through level 4, and how much more careful you have to get at each level. Because I'll agree, if it's a simple, it's recommending a book to you, okay, there may be a limit to how much money you want to spend on fairness. But if it's making a life or death decision, you certainly want to then check on the fairness quite significantly. I think that framework is quite good, and I would recommend that to people to read.
My last question for the day, and it is coming from the audience. How do you think about giving back to India? How should we think about giving back to India?
Look, I want to be careful on that. It's important in the roles we play. So I'm the leader of a large multinational company. It's not about giving back to India. That's at a very personal level. The company has to be a good citizen in all of the countries it operates in. So we believe fundamentally that if I look at the 4 principles of stakeholder capitalism, your stakeholders are your clients, number 1, your employees, the communities you operate in, which is the third, and of course your investors. Okay, so if I look then at the third one, which is the communities you operate in, we believe heavily in skilling. So we operate in the US, we work with the P-Tech schools. How do we work with people from disadvantaged communities and skill them? In India, we have committed to skilling, especially disadvantaged women. We just opened up a set of schools and skilling programs in Nagaland. We have them through NASCOM for women all over India. We recently helped fund a medical research hospital at IIT Kanpur, etc. So I'll say that first from a corporate perspective. You must be good and aligned with the priorities of the nation and communities and what we can do, which is of unique value. At a personal level, I fundamentally believe in giving back. I believe in giving back, and the areas that I have picked are around education. So I've always helped my mother. She has helped run a school for disadvantaged children in Delhi. How do we help fund that? 2, give back to the institutions where I have learned a lot, be it IIT Kanpur or be it Illinois. I've encouraged my children to go back to India and get involved in education of disadvantaged communities. So each person has to pick their own. Now, there will come a stage when I'm no longer an active executive spending whatever amount of time I spend each week on work. And at that point, then I would like to probably get more involved, probably both in the US and in India at that point. But we have picked as a family that education is what we give back to.
Dr. Krishna, it was amazing to talk to you. We will love to have you back at Columbia physically whenever you have time and the opportunity comes. It was immensely informative, and we are all very, very grateful for your frank and forthright opinion. We learn from your thought process. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Singh, and to your students for having the patience to put up with me for an hour.